To most, a dollar is just a dollar. But for women working in all fields, a dollar earned is not equal to a man's. I, as a woman, have been personally affected by the wage gap. So has my sister, cousins, mother, grandmothers, and so on and so forth. The pattern goes on and on for generation after generations. Cases of women earning less than men for doing the exact job is sadly a problem all across America's workforce. According to the textbook titled Diversity in Organizations by Myrtle Bell, the female to male earning ratio remains less than 80%. This statistic alone shows that the wage gap is still very present, and for women of color, even more so. When I experienced the wage gap, when I was discriminated against for being a woman, I didn't know what I could do about it. That is why today I will be discussing who is affected by the wage gap and what you, the audience, either male or female, can do to stop it. And if need be, what organizations out there can help women fight for what they are worth. I will start with the story of Lilly Ledbetter. Now, she was a manager at a Goodyear tire store in Birmingham, Alabama for 19 years. She had the same experience and knowledge as all the other men working around her, and in some cases more. Yet one day she found a note left in her work mailbox. In Lily's own words, the note had 4 names, Lilly and 3 other men. And when I looked and saw how much they were making, base pay only, I just felt so degraded. That day, from an anonymous note, Lilly found out the difference of salary between her and 3 men in or below her exact position. The difference of pay was drastic, and it was not in a good way. Till this day, Miss Ledbetter does not know where the note came from. Perhaps it was from some do-gooder in human resources who had access to the information and was tired of the wage gap still costing women in the 21st century. Either way, Lilly could not waste this information. She was determined to do something to help close the wage gap. Studies show that consistently women make less than men. Even when women are doing the same jobs with the same amount of education or experience, the wage gap is still prevalent. The Equal Pay Act that was passed in 1964 was supposed to prevent wage discrimination, but somehow employers are still getting away with undervaluing the women in our workforce. So why might this be happening? Some argue that women go for lower paying jobs like nurses, receptionists, or teacher. This is referred to as sex segregation. The textbook written by Myrtle P. Bell, a professor and associate dean in a diversity, racial equity, and inclusion department in the College of Business at the University of Texas, Arlington, defines sex segregation as when members of one sex constitute 70% or more of the job or occupation. When an occupation is female-dominated, it can then lead to the workforce being undervalued and thus underpaid. But studies show that when men enter female-dominated jobs, they earn more than their female peers. And this excuse of sex segregation does not work for Lilly Ledbetter's situation. She was in a male-dominated field, working for Goodyear Tire. She was doing the same job as other men, yet her work was being underpaid compared to her male peers. And sadly, the wage gap only gets wider when we talk for women of color. According to the new Pittsburgh Courier, by every measure, the wage gap is the greatest for women of color. Black women in particular make 63 cents on the dollar compared to white men. This difference is staggering, especially since women of color are most likely to be affected by poverty. Just like sex segregation, there is a segregation of what jobs women of color hold compared to their white counterpart. Women of color consistently hold lower paying jobs than white women. This not only widens the wage gap, but economic conditions between different races and ethnicities as a whole. According to the same Pittsburgh Courier article, for every $1 of net worth for a white American, Latino Americans had 9 cents, and Black Americans had 7 cents. The disparity of pay between women in a minority race or ethnicity only raises the need for the jobs women do, black or white, to be valued as much as men's. The gap of wages for women and men does not stop at initial pay, but negotiations for promotions and raises. There is a misconception that women also undervalue their labor compared to men's, but that is simply not true. According to Bell, researchers found that women were not less likely than men to negotiate salary offers, but when they did negotiate, they were less likely to receive as much. Why is this happening? Where is it coming from? It may come from the misconception that women have not been in the workforce as long as men, and thus have less experience and are less productive. But this is yet another myth that can be easily debunked by realizing that women have been in the workforce since the Industrial Revolution, and they now make up 51% of the participating gender in the workforce. Before that, women were working in the fields alongside their husbands during harvest, and when they weren't outside, they were raising a family, keeping a household, and this just goes to show that women have never been a stranger to hard labor. And even now, as women fight to close the wage gap through their education and their experience, and by now comprising the majority of the workforce at 51%, organizations and managers continue to undervalue their contributions based on this misconception of what women can and cannot do. As women become the majority gender in the workforce, it begs the question of why should someone care about the wage gap, especially if they're men and not affected by it. There is another misconception that men are the so-called winners of the wage gap, and for anyone married to a woman, they understand this is totally untrue. For those starting families and going forward, the wage gap affects everyone involved. Lilly herself remarked on how the wage gap not only affected her, but her entire family. In Lilly's own words, I had children in college. We had a mortgage to pay. We had car payments. And it was just so hard to make ends meet. But then to stand there and look at those numbers and just think back to how hard it had been on my family, it was totally unnecessary. This goes to show that the fight for equal pay is for everyone. The fight is not just for women, but for their families, their spouses, and for all that depend on them. Despite the myth that women have less to offer than men, especially in physically required jobs, and despite a long history of discrimination, women are becoming more educated than men. Not only are women starting to participate more in male-dominated fields like the police force, military service, and jobs in STEM, according to Dr. Hale, currently more than 60% of young advanced degree holders are women. And the difference between educated women and men only increases for women of color, as Black and Hispanic women have more education than their co-ethnic men. As well as becoming more educated, women are debunking myths that they cannot compete in male-dominated fields and professions. According to the Pew Research Center, since 1973, the number of women serving on active duty has risen sevenfold, from 2% to 14%, and among commissioned officers has quadrupled from 4% to 16%. With each day women join male-dominated fields due to their experience and education, women continue the fight for justice of equal pay. This takes us back to the Lilly Ledbetter story. Once she found out how much less she was making than her male peers, she was not going to settle for it. She was going to use her education and her experience to take the fight for equal pay as far as she could. According to an interview conducted by Makers on YouTube, Lilly Ledbetter told her husband after finding the note at work, "I want to file a charge with the Equal Employment Commission. If I started, I would be in it for the long haul. I would not quit." And true to her word, Lilly did not quit her fight for equal pay. her file for discrimination against her employer lasted 10 years, and according to her website, required Ledbetter to spar with the Supreme Court and lobby Capitol Hill. After a decade of advocating for women, Ledbetter did make history in the fight for equal pay. Her fight went so high that in 2009, President Obama signed the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. According to Myrtle P. Bell, this act changed the decision that required compensation discrimination charges to be filed within 180 days. Now, because of Lilly Ledbetter, every paycheck that delivered discrimination, the employee had a new clock reset to file a complaint. So this would allow women to be more vocal with employers and their peers on what they were making. And if they found a problem, women had 180 days after each paycheck to fight for what they are worth. So how can we all be like Lilly Ledbetter and the mysterious note leaver and help close the wage gap? It starts with being open about compensation, being open with fellow employees about what everyone is earning. And it may be thought as taboo, but this is a start to holding employers accountable. Talking about the wage gap can also reveal glaring pay discrimination so that women can take action against their employer. The practice of sharing compensation is called wage transparency. And according to a journal by the Canadian Review of Sociology, pay secrecy, which limits the detection of individual and systematic underpayment, has recently come under increased scrutiny as a barrier to equitable pay. Because pay secrecy can cover up discrimination, pay transparency is a practice that is protected by law. This means that an employer cannot stop workers from sharing pay grids with one another. This includes making it illegal for managers to threaten employees with discipline or termination if they share salaries with one another. Pay transparency is a start to end gender discrimination and is a way for male allies to help women close the wage gap together. So what if you as a woman find out through wage transparency or some other mode that you are making less than your male coworkers for essentially the same job? That is where the EEOC comes in. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a federal government agency created to protect the workforce, especially when it comes to workplace discrimination. According to the EEOC's website, it is responsible for enforcing federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against job applicant or employees because of the person's race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, or genetic information. So that is a lot to cover, which means if a woman is unable to hire a lawyer for whatever reason, she can then file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they will look into the case and see if she's being discriminated against. So if they do find a discrimination, then they will work with the employer to reimburse compensation lost to the employee because of that discrimination. And even in some cases, the EEOC will take employers to court. And according to the government website, the EEOC has the authority to file a lawsuit to protect the rights of individuals and the interests of the public. So in Ledbetter's case, she was not satisfied with her settlement. She then pushed even further by lobbying and working with Congress, overturning a Supreme Court ruling that limited the amount of time to file a discrimination complaint. And this eventually helped create a law for President Obama to sign that made it so that women could use their knowledge of discrimination, and it was without the threat of a ticking timeline. Knowledge is power is a famous quote from Francis Bacon, but as it applies to the wage gap, knowledge is the most power an employee can hold if they are being discriminated against based on gender. The knowledge that pay transparency is completely legal and employers cannot threaten or punish employees from taking part in it gives power for women to discuss the wages they're receiving. The knowledge that the wage gap is discrimination and that there are organizations like the EEOC that will fight on behalf of individuals gives power to women to fight for equal pay. And finally, the knowledge that the pay gap is still prevalent gives power to women and their allies to speak out against the injustice and demand that women in America are finally paid for what they are worth. Thank you.